Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to History 120. For this second half, second portion of the lecture, I want to continue talking about the descent towards revolution and the separation away from the British government. In the wake of the Stamp Act, we see protests, as we talked about last time, across the colonies. We even see these protests supported in British Parliament. These are notes from one of the speeches in support of the colonists that essentially say that these are people who went to the edge of the known world to establish a new life. They have been neglected by the British government until now. It's not that they haven't been good citizens. We've done nothing for them. How can we demand them to pay their taxes at this time? You can go ahead and read the comments for yourself when I post the PowerPoints, but it's all really for naught. We'll see eventually the Stamp Act repealed with the Declaratory Act in 1766. But what we see in the protests to the Stamp Act are the groundwork laid for future events. We have committees of correspondence established amongst the various colonies trying to unify a response. We see widespread street protests. We see the creation of the Sons of Liberty, a group that will protest the actions of colonial officials essentially for the next 9 years on and off. Will get their start in this period after the Stamp Act. We'll see the Stamp Act Congress established, where 9 colonies will send 27 delegates to write a unified response to send to Parliament as a means of protesting as a body these Stamp Acts. This is a first time where we see 13 disparate colonies created differently, created by different people, ruled in different manners, coming together in order to create a response against British parliamentary policy. It'll work. The Stamp Act will be revoked in 1766, but we'll have a very important codicil put onto it. The Declaratory Act will state unequivocally that the British government has the right to tax the American colonies whenever they see fit, however they see fit, whether or not there is representation in the Parliament. We need to continue raising income for the British, however. Again, we've done nothing to alleviate England's debt. Citizens living in the mainland of England are heavily taxed to support the government and the colonies who are refusing to pay their taxes. And what we get in 1767, are the Townshend Acts. Charles Townshend is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Essentially, he pays England's bills. He controls the purse strings of the English treasury. And at his behest, we see a series of acts passed in order to raise money to pay for the royal administrators who are now in charge of the British colonies, the royal governors, the tax collectors, etc. We're going to see a revenue act to tax tea, paper, glass, and paint that are imported into the colonies. We'll see an indemnity act where tea imported to England by the British East India Company is no longer taxed. Now, for now, with the Townshend Acts, the British East India Company must send all of its tea to London for the London tea auction before it can be dispersed to other companies or private individuals, or before it can be dispersed to the colonies. But the British East India Company won't have to pay any taxes on that tea. Other tea importers will. We'll see a Commissioners of Customs Act that will control who collects customs, which are taxes that are paid on goods brought in to the colonies. And we'll see a Vice Admiralty Act passed. This will enforce trade laws by prosecuting people who break trade law in British Royal Navy courts. These are courts without jury. So if you are charged with smuggling, you're not going to be charged or tried in the normal civil courts. You're going to be tried in military courts without trials, without juries of your peers to determine your guilt or innocence. The Townsend Acts, again, are wildly unpopular. People see these as direct assaults on their rights as English citizens. There will be boycotts of goods that are taxed. We'll see again a turn to protests in the streets, near riots by individuals in major cities. Rioting, you need to understand, is loud protest marches. These are things that have a deep history in British common law and British common custom when people feel their rights are ignored or taken advantage of. We'll see non-importation agreements signed by private citizens. Essentially, these are petitions where people vow that they will not buy goods imported from England. This means that we're going to turn to colonial production of certain goods. We're not going to buy finished cloth coming out of English mills. We're going to spin our own fiber and make our own cloth, just like our grandparents did. Um, that's what this generation is saying, because people weren't, unless you were living on the frontier and far away from centers of commerce. If you lived in Boston or Richmond or Williamsburg, you had port access to some of the greatest and cheap cloth goods available at this time. If by living in Boston and hiring on or signing on to the non-importation agreement, that means that you're going to try and make your own fabric now, which you hadn't done in a generation. If you actually look at the document in the PowerPoint, you can see that we have a list of some of the goods, millinery goods, hats, um, women and children's stays for their garments, chinaware, so porcelain goods, silks, cottons, um, all sorts of goods. People agree to try and boycott and refuse to purchase from English merchants. Um, Also, if you look about in the center column, about 3 people down, you see the name of Paul Revere signing on to this. So this is a pretty widespread popular means of protesting the Townsend Acts. We'll have some of these teachings or ideas put together in a book of essays called Letters from a Farmer, which are essentially protest letters written to the editor about why we should protest the Townsend Acts as an affront to the English citizenry in the New World. In Boston, the riots are going to be a little more forcible because Boston is a seaport town. It is one of the major seaport towns in North America. It lives and breathes by the ports. So any type of new laws or regulations based on changing how importation happens, these are pretty grievous assaults on the people of Boston. So the tax enforcement is especially going to be unpopular in Boston. Impressment is going on at the same time. Impressment is the forced enlistment of people into the British Navy. If a ship pulls into port and some of their crewmen have died or some of their crewmen have deserted, the captain is allowed to refill the number of people under his command by going out and literally arresting people into the Navy. It's a last minute, last ditch attempt to fill a vessel's recruitment lists, but it is going on. We also have a lot of smugglers in Boston, and the smugglers in Boston don't like that they're being called on the carpet or arrested or brought under uh, increased scrutiny because of their actions. Men like John Hancock, who try to present themselves as respectable merchant citizens, are active smugglers taking part in the underground economies of tax avoidance and cheap goods. So we'll see a lot of protests against the Townsend Acts. The Townsend Acts are wildly unpopular. On March 5th, 1770, Lord North, the Prime Minister of England, will put forward a bill calling for the partial repeal of the Townsend Act of the Townsend Acts. They are unpopular. We need to find a new middle ground, and Parliament will in the next few weeks agree with him. The only thing that they'll call into question is repealing the Tea Act. The tea tax will remain because, again, we need to have some enforcement of the concept that Parliament is able to tax the colonies at will. Unfortunately, hours later and half a world away, while people did not know that North had called for the repeal of these, we have one of the first great steps towards revolution take place. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, the garrison, members of the garrison of Boston, the British soldiers who are there to enforce the law and protect the seat of governmental power in Boston, are attacked by members of a mob. It's a cold, snowy March. People are throwing snowballs. People don't like the British Army. The sailors don't like the British Army. They're seen as outsiders. They're not seen as fellow members protecting their rights as British citizens. This is an imposition of the British government upon private citizens. This is one of the reasons we don't like standing armies. And if you want to see a video of the events, of a recreation of the events, a very good recreation of the events done in Boston at the site of the massacre, I encourage you to follow that link, which will be in the PowerPoint as well that I'll post this afternoon. But this is the Boston Customs House. This is where anything imported through the Port of Boston is brought in to have its taxes assessed. On the far side, on the far side that we can't see from this position, there's a door very similar to the one that we can see. And at that door is a British soldier. He's on guard duty that night. It is simply his job to keep anybody from entering that door that is not supposed to enter. It's after hours. No one has any reason to enter. If need be, they can approach the guard. He'll call for the officer of the day, and he will then go through the procedures of either getting that man in or getting an appointment set for that person to enter at the appropriate time. Unfortunately, at this night, tempers are high. People are regularly taunting the soldiers when they are on duty. It's a snowy night. People have been throwing snowballs at the soldiers on duty. They've been yelling at him, calling him names, calling him lobsterback, calling him redcoat, taunting him, calling him worse names. They've been throwing snowballs at him, and as the night has progressed, as people have come out of the bars drunk, the language has become more vulgar. The snowballs have chunks of ice in them. The soldier calls out in the night after being knocked down and harassed by snowballs and by the mob. He calls out, "Captain of the guard, to the post! Captain of the guard!" And when this happens, the captain of the guard comes to relieve his century. This is military dogma. This is military doctrine. If you are called out, you bring out 4 or 5 of your soldiers. This is the relief. The relief only calls out in times of duress when he needs to be relieved and needs to be supported. So, into the middle of this mess, the captain of the guard that night runs in with several of his men to reinforce this position. He calls for the protesters, he calls for the people throwing snowballs to disperse, that they are an illegal mob. Unfortunately, the only thing this does is make the situation worse, and more people come and stand before him, come and are yelling at him to go home, to leave the city, to leave Boston. We start seeing the crowd get closer and closer in to the soldiers who have reinforced this century's post. The yelling gets worse. There are some people who are trying to find a means of calming the situation down, of bringing both sides to a peaceful resolution. Some call for the guards to go home, to abandon their post, and that will diffuse the crowd. The captain, the officers, the crowd themselves, the British soldiers themselves are yelling for the crowd to disperse, that they are breaking the law. And ultimately, we don't know what happens. We don't know who yells the wrong thing or who does the wrong thing. Members of the crowd are daring the soldiers to fire. They're still throwing snowballs, and it's very possible that a soldier slips on the ice. A Brown Bess, the British infantry firearm, is a muzzleloader. It's a flintlock muzzleloader. The working mechanisms are all on the exterior of the lock plate of the weapon. If it falls and lands butt first, it's very possible that the gun could have gone off just straight up into the air. Could be because it could be that a soldier fell because of his losing balance on the ice. He could have been hit with a snowball. Soldiers are being yelled at by the crowd. Fire on me, you son of a bitch! Shoot me! And for some reason, guns go off. Looking down from the customs house, that dark circle in the pavement is where the main body of the center of the crowd were standing that night. And that's where the British soldiers fired into the mob. We don't know at whose command. We don't know if there was even a command. It could have been just the impulse to preserve life. But that spot right there is where the first blood was shed in the American Revolution. That spot right there are where Crispus Attucks, the first African American to die, and 4 or 5 other men fell as the British soldiers fired into the mob. They were taken away. They were interred in a common grave on a cemetery not far off Boston Common. This is where they were buried. Victims of the massacre of March 5th, 1770. For 3 years, Boston lay simmering under tension. Troops were pulled back out of the city proper, but still within close proximity of the city at one of its fortifications. And next time, we will talk about the road to war. Thanks for your attention.